Greetings all, my name is Rob Newsome. I'm a director here at PKF VGA Advisory, and we do a lot of internal audit and risk work, and I just want to talk to you today about just some of the developments that I'm seeing in the marketplace and what's happening. The first one is around the new IAA standards, which are now called the global standards. So there's no IPPF or anything like that, it's just global standards, full stop. I think this is a move by the IAA to establish themselves as the only body that issues standards for internal audit, which is fine. I think they certainly have the ability to do that, and I see nothing wrong with that. But I do find it's quite interesting in some of the changes. We did a complete exercise for the changes, and basically all of the standards are included. There's some additional items which come in, which I think is where the interest is. They're trying to force the audit committees to take more responsibility for the internal audit function. They're looking at the internal audit function being more strategic, so that they have to consider the performance of the auditors in achieving the assurance that the board will want ultimately. And one of the ways they are doing that is requiring the internal audit function to create its own strategy. And clearly that strategy must be related to the company strategy. So it does create quite an interesting issue. If you were an internal audit function, that's quite easy. Well, this is our strategy. This is how it fits in with the company strategy or the entity strategy, and that's all good. But when you're now a service provider like we are, we've actually got to sit together with management and say, look, this is ultimately your strategy, it's not us. We will help you draft it, but it ties in with you. And it's not so much about sourcing, because that's just a manner in which internal audit is completed. It's about what it is that you're wanting to do with internal audit, and how internal audit is aiming to provide the right sort of strategy, the stakeholder engagements, those sort of matters which really impact on the delivery of good internal audit. The second issue I'd like to talk about is that of combined assurance. It seems to have got a bit of a revival at the moment, that people are now saying, okay, we need something to do with combined assurance. Some people don't know what it's all about, and it's sort of, to some extent, lingering, and some extent it's okay. And I think the main areas of concern come around the so-called second and third lines of defense. Line one, which is management, they do what management does, and they are already providing assurance. And the line two and line three will look at what management does when setting the scope of their work. The main thing that the assurance providers will sit is in line 2 and 3, and that's where internal audit and the line 2 people really need to coordinate to make sure they're not over auditing some of the areas. If I take a client where you say got masses of investments, I'm going to use a medical aid as an example. They have a whole investment committee and actuaries and all sorts of people doing work there, and we assess that, and we are saying, well, actually that's enough assurance. We as internal audit probably don't have the skills to audit some of the actuarial models and way that they are managing those funds, and we will then just look at the output that comes from the assurance providers in reaching our assessments and the overall assessment that we provide at the end of the year. So I think the issue there is clearly internal audit doesn't have to do everything. which I think is a good point. And the other point, which I think is important, though, is that the assurance providers in the second line and even the third line, especially when you get to the external auditors, they've actually got to acknowledge the sort of work they are doing against the identified risks. But therein lies another issue on combined assurance. You've got an issue where combined assurance is giving assurance against the risks. So some people believe all you got to do is take your top 10 risks or all your strategic risks and provide how assurance is provided against those top risks. I believe you actually got to look at this in a more of a process type basis, because you want to look at all the risks. You don't only want to look at the top risks or the top exposures. I'll give you an example. I've done a lot of work at Eskom, and I was very surprised not to see Coburg as a risk for Eskom. And they said, no, it's well managed. I said, well, surely from an assurance point of view, you want to make sure it stays well managed. Because if it doesn't stay well managed, there's a really, really big potential disaster on your hands. So I believe you've got to provide assurance over all areas. Obviously, the extent of assurance will depend on the possible biggest impact. Yes, of course, you can rely on the controls that they might have in place, but you've actually got to consider all risks. And the best way to do that is process-wise, because that's the way typically you do an audit. You'll do an audit over procurement. You won't just do an audit over 3 risks in procurement. So that is the view I have of auditing the processes and then aligning those risks that are in the processes into process order, so you can now prove you've validated the assurance against all risks, not just the top risks. Well, that's enough for me today. Stand tuned and you may hear from us again.